Louis Armstrong froze in the middle of the stage for the first time in his life. 15,000 people were watching him, and nobody knew what was about to happen. 1968, Los Angeles. 67-year-old Louis had stepped onto the stage carrying a body worn down by years of exhaustion. "What a wonderful world," began. Louis raised the microphone, opened his mouth, and nothing came out. The lyrics had vanished completely. Panic appeared in Louis's eyes. Over 40 years of career, thousands of concerts, millions of fans, and now for the first time the legend was helpless. The hall sank into a heavy silence. Seconds passed like hours. Then something unexpected happened. Something no one could have predicted, something even Louis himself never expected, and that moment changed Louis Armstrong's eyes forever. So what really happened that night? And why did Louis remember this moment as the most important moment of his life? The answer reveals one of the most emotionally powerful moments in music history, a moment when a legend discovered what his audience truly meant to him. If this story has already touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to discover will remind you why music exists and what it truly means to be loved. But this story doesn't begin on that stage in Los Angeles. It begins 3 weeks earlier in a hospital room in New York where Louis Armstrong sat listening to words he had been dreading for years. The doctor's face was grave, his voice measured, but unmistakably serious. Louis's heart was failing. The years of constant touring, the relentless schedule, the physical demands of playing trumpet night after night for over 4 decades, all of it had taken an irreversible toll. "Mr. Armstrong, you need to stop performing," the doctor said. "Your heart cannot handle the strain anymore. If you continue at this pace, I cannot guarantee you will survive another year." Louis sat in silence, processing the words, feeling them land like stones in his chest. Stop performing? Stop playing music? For Louis Armstrong, those words were indistinguishable from stop breathing or stop living. Louis had been performing since he was a child in New Orleans, since the days when he was just a poor black boy from the worst neighborhood in the city, since the era when his only escape from poverty and hardship was the music that flowed through the streets like a river of hope. Music had saved Louis's life, literally saved it, when he was 11 years old and sent to the Colored Waif's Home for Boys after firing a gun into the air during New Year's celebrations. It was at that reform school that Louis first learned to play cornet, first discovered that he had a gift, first understood that music could be his path out of the circumstances that had trapped everyone he knew. From that moment forward, Louis had never stopped playing. Not when he was hungry, not when he was tired, not when racist venue owners made him enter through back doors, not when critics dismissed him, not when his body began to fail him in his 60s. Louis Armstrong played because playing was living, and living without playing was unthinkable. So when the doctor told Louis to stop, Louis did what he had always done when faced with impossible choices. He ignored the advice and kept going. His wife Lucille begged him to listen, to take a break, to prioritize his health over his career. His manager Joe Glazer urged him to cancel the upcoming tour, to rest, to give his heart time to recover. But Louis refused. "People bought tickets to see Louis Armstrong," he told Lucille that night. "Those people saved their money, made plans, expected to see a show. How can I let them down? How can I tell them Louis Armstrong is too tired, too old, too sick to play for them?" Lucille cried, knowing she couldn't change his mind, knowing that the man she loved was slowly choosing music over his own life. The information in this video is compiled from documented interviews, archival news, books, and historical reports. For narrative purposes, some parts are dramatized and may not represent 100% factual accuracy. We also use AI-assisted visuals and AI narration for cinematic reconstruction. The use of AI does not mean the story is fake. It is a storytelling tool. Our goal is to recreate the spirit of that era as faithfully as possible. Enjoy watching. The tour that preceded the Los Angeles concert was a nightmare that Louis never discussed publicly. Night after night, Lewis pushed himself onto stages across America, playing trumpet and singing despite chest pains that sometimes made him gasp for breath between songs. His band members watched with growing alarm as Louis struggled through performances that used to be effortless. Velma Middleton, Lewis's longtime vocalist and friend, later recalled that Louis would sometimes sit in his dressing room for 30 minutes after shows. Unable to move, his face gray with exhaustion, his hands trembling. "I asked him why he kept doing it," Velma said in an interview years later. "Why he didn't just rest. And he looked at me and said, 'Velma, if I stop playing, I die. At least this way I die doing what I love.'" 2 weeks before the Los Angeles concert, Louis had a minor heart episode backstage in Chicago. The pain was sudden and sharp, radiating down his left arm, making him drop his trumpet and clutch his chest. His road manager wanted to call an ambulance, but Louis refused. "It's nothing," Louis insisted, even though his face was covered in sweat and his breathing was labored. "Just give me a minute." After 10 minutes of rest, Louis went on stage and performed the entire show, never letting the audience know that moments earlier he had been wondering if he was dying. That was Louis Armstrong, the man who smiled through pain, who entertained through exhaustion, who gave everything to his audience, even when he had nothing left to give. The week before Los Angeles, something else happened that weighed heavily on Louis's mind. He received a letter from a young musician named Marcus Johnson, a 22-year-old trumpet player from Chicago who had grown up idolizing Louis. Marcus wrote that he was thinking of quitting music because the industry was too hard, too competitive, too unwelcoming to young black artists. "Mr. Armstrong," Marcus wrote, "I don't know if I have what it takes. Sometimes I wonder if it's all worth it." Louis read that letter 3 times, and each time he felt a deep sadness, not for Marcus, but for himself. Because Louis had been asking himself the same question lately. Was it all worth it? The decades of sacrifice, the toll on his health, the relationships neglected, the life spent in hotel rooms and on tour buses instead of at home with his wife? Was any of it worth it? Louis decided to write back to Marcus, but he couldn't find the words. Every time he sat down to compose a response, his mind went blank. What could he tell this young man? Keep going and destroy your health like I did. Give up and always wonder what might have been. Louis had no answers because Louis was struggling with the same questions himself. The letter sat unanswered on Louis's desk as he traveled to Los Angeles for what would become one of the most significant nights of his career. Have you ever pushed yourself beyond your limits for something you love? Share your experience in the comments. The night of the Los Angeles concert, September 14, 1968, arrived with a weight that Louis felt in every bone of his body. The venue was the Los Angeles Forum, one of the largest and most prestigious concert halls in the country. 15,000 tickets had been sold, every seat filled with people who had come specifically to see Louis Armstrong perform. Louis stood backstage looking at himself in the mirror, and for the first time in his life, he didn't recognize the man staring back at him. The face was old, tired, marked by decades of strain. The eyes that had once sparkled with infectious joy now looked hollow, haunted by exhaustion and the knowledge that each performance might be his last. Louis's hands shook as he adjusted his bow tie, and he wondered if tonight would be the night his body finally gave out completely. Lucille had traveled with Louis to this concert, which was unusual. She rarely accompanied him on tour anymore. But something about this trip had felt different to her, more urgent, more final. She sat in the front row watching the stage with a mixture of pride and terror, knowing that the man she loved was pushing himself toward a breaking point from which there might be no return. Lucille had made Louis promise to see another doctor as soon as the tour ended, and Louis had agreed, though both of them knew he was just saying what she needed to hear. Louis Armstrong never stop performing. The only question was whether performance would stop him first. When Louis finally walked onto that stage, the audience erupted in applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. 15,000 people rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, shouting Louis's name with an enthusiasm that would have energized any performer. But Louis felt strangely detached from it all, as if he were watching himself from a distance, observing his own body move through motions that had become automatic after 40 years. He waved to the crowd, smiled his famous smile, raised his trumpet in greeting, all the gestures that audiences expected, all the rituals that had defined his public persona for decades. But inside, Louis felt empty, disconnected, struggling to remember why any of this mattered. The first half of the concert went smoothly, or at least appeared to. Louis played his greatest hits, Hello Dolly, and Mac the Knife, and When the Saints Go Marching In, and the audience responded with the enthusiasm he had come to expect. But between songs, Louis was struggling. His chest hurt. His breathing was labored. His hands trembled on the trumpet valves in ways that made certain notes difficult to play cleanly. Louis covered his struggles with showmanship, with jokes and banter that kept the audience entertained while he caught his breath. But inside, Louis was counting down the songs until he could get off stage and collapse in his dressing room. Then came the moment that changed everything. The band began playing the introduction to What a Wonderful World, the song that had become Louis' signature, the song that audiences around the world associated with his voice and his spirit. Louis raised the microphone to his lips, opened his mouth to sing the opening lines, and nothing happened. The lyrics that he had sung thousands of times, the words that were as familiar to him as his own name, had completely vanished from his mind. Louis stood on stage, microphone in hand, mouth open, with 15,000 people watching and waiting, and he could not remember a single word of the song. If you're feeling the tension of this moment, please subscribe. What happens next is beyond anything you can imagine. The silence that fell over the Los Angeles Forum was unlike anything Louis had ever experienced. It wasn't the respectful silence of an audience waiting for a song to begin. It was the confused, uncomfortable silence of 15,000 people who had just witnessed something go terribly wrong. Louis's face went pale. His famous smile disappeared. His hands began to shake visibly, the microphone trembling in his grip. The band continued playing the introduction, waiting for Louis to start singing, but Louis couldn't sing because Louis couldn't remember the words. For 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours, Louis Armstrong stood frozen on that stage, experiencing a terror he had never known in his entire career. This was his nightmare made real. This was everything he had feared about getting older, about his body failing him, about the moment when the music that had defined his life would finally slip beyond his grasp. Louis looked out at the sea of faces, 15,000 people who had paid money and taken time to see him perform, and he felt like he was drowning. His chest tightened, his vision blurred. He wondered if this was what dying felt like, this sensation of everything you've worked for crumbling around you while the world watches. Louis's mind raced through possibilities. Should he apologize and leave the stage? Should he ask the band to play a different song? Should he pretend he was having some kind of artistic moment and hope the audience would interpret his silence as intentional? Every option seemed impossible. Every choice seemed wrong, and the silence kept stretching, growing heavier with each passing second. Louis had spent his entire life making people happy, bringing joy to millions through his music, and now he was about to become a spectacle of failure. A sad old man who couldn't even remember his own songs. The thought was unbearable. And then Louis heard something. At first, he thought he was imagining it. A sound so soft it was almost imperceptible, rising from somewhere in the front rows of the audience. A voice. A small voice. A child's voice. Someone was singing, quietly, hesitantly, but unmistakably singing the words to What a Wonderful World. Louis looked toward the sound and saw her, a little girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, sitting in the front row next to a woman who must have been her mother. The girl had started singing the song that Louis couldn't remember, her small voice cutting through the terrible silence like a ray of light, through darkness. What happened next was something no one in that audience would ever forget. The man sitting next to the little girl joined in, then the woman behind them, then a whole row of people, then another row, and another. Within seconds, the singing spread through the entire audience like a wave, like a force of nature, like something that couldn't be stopped or controlled. 15,000 people began singing, What a Wonderful World, in unison, their voices filling the enormous hall, creating a sound so powerful and so beautiful that even the band stopped playing to listen. 15,000 people were singing for Louis Armstrong because Louis Armstrong couldn't sing for himself. Louis stood on that stage, microphone still raised, and felt tears streaming down his face. Not tears of embarrassment or shame, but tears of overwhelming emotion, gratitude, love, astonishment at what he was witnessing. These people, these strangers who had come to hear him perform, were giving him the gift of their voices when his own voice had failed. They weren't laughing at him. They weren't leaving. They weren't judging him for his failure. They were lifting him up, carrying him through the moment, showing him that his music mattered so much to them that they had memorized every word and were willing to sing it for him when he couldn't sing it himself. The audience sang the entire song, all 3 verses, while Louis stood on stage weeping openly. When they finished, the applause that followed was thunderous. Not just applause for the song, but applause for the extraordinary moment of connection that had just occurred. Louis tried to speak, tried to thank them, but his voice was choked with emotion. Finally, he managed to say into the microphone, "I've been performing for 40 years. I've played for presidents and kings, but I have never in my life felt this loved." The audience erupted again, cheering, crying, united in a shared experience that transcended the normal boundaries between performer and audience. That night changed Louis Armstrong in ways that took him months to fully understand. He had walked onto that stage feeling empty, disconnected, questioning whether his life's work had any meaning. He walked off that stage knowing the answer. His music wasn't just entertainment. It was something people carried in their hearts, something they loved so deeply that they had memorized every word, something that connected them to each other and to him in ways that transcended ordinary experience. Louis' songs weren't just songs. They were part of people's lives, woven into their memories and their emotions and their understanding of what made the world wonderful. The letter to Marcus Johnson that Louis had been unable to write suddenly became easy. The next morning, Louis sat down and wrote a response that Marcus would keep for the rest of his life. "Last night," Louis wrote, "I forgot the words to my own song on stage in front of 15,000 people. I thought it was the worst moment of my career, but then the audience sang the song for me, every word. 15,000 voices united in a song I taught them without even knowing it. That's when I understood why we do this. We don't play music for the money or the fame or the applause. We play because music connects people. It gives them something to hold on to. It becomes part of who they are. And when you create something that becomes part of someone else's life, you're never really forgotten. That's why it's worth it, Marcus. Keep playing. Not for yourself, for everyone who will carry your music in their hearts long after you're gone." The little girl who started singing that night was named Emily Carter. She was 8 years old, attending her first concert ever, brought by her mother as a birthday present. Emily didn't know that Louis Armstrong was a legend. She didn't know that he had been performing longer than her mother had been alive. She only knew that she loved "What a Wonderful World" because her grandmother used to sing it to her, and when the nice man on stage couldn't remember the words, Emily wanted to help. Her mother later said that Emily didn't even realize what she had started. She was just a little girl singing a song she loved, unaware that her small voice would be the spark that ignited 15,000 others. Louis made a point of meeting Emily after the concert. He brought her backstage, introduced her to his band, gave her a signed photograph and a hug that Emily would remember for the rest of her life. "You saved me tonight," Louis told her, kneeling down to be at her eye level. "When I couldn't find the words, you found them for me. I'm going to remember you forever, Emily, and I hope you never stop singing." Emily's mother was crying. Louis's wife, Lucille, was crying. Even the hardened road crew members were wiping their eyes. It was one of those rare moments when the barriers between people dissolved completely, leaving only human connection in their purest form. The Los Angeles concert became legendary among Louis Armstrong's fans. Bootleg recordings of that night circulated for years, and people who hadn't been there claimed they had been, wanting to be part of the story. Music historians later called it one of the most remarkable moments in concert history, not because of Louis's failure, but because of what that failure revealed. It revealed the depth of connection between artist and audience. It revealed that music isn't a one-way transmission from performer to listener, but a shared experience that belongs to everyone who loves it, and it revealed something about Louis Armstrong's character that confirmed what those who knew him already understood. This man was loved not just for his talent, but for his humanity. Louis Armstrong continued performing for 3 more years after that night in Los Angeles. His health continued to decline. There was no stopping that. But something in his spirit had been renewed. He no longer performed out of obligation or habit. He performed with a conscious awareness of what his music meant to people, a gratitude for every audience that came to see him, and an understanding that each concert might be his last. Louis died on July 6, 1971, in his sleep at his home in Queens. He was 69 years old. His last public performance had been just months earlier, and by all accounts he had played with the same joy and energy he'd had as a young man in New Orleans. At Louis Armstrong's funeral, 15,000 people gathered to pay their respects. It was the same number, 15,000, as the audience at that Los Angeles concert 3 years earlier, though no one planned it that way. Among the mourners was Emily Carter, now 11 years old, standing with her mother and grandmother, holding a photograph that Louis had signed for her that night in 1968. Emily didn't speak at the funeral. She was just a child, but she stood quietly and listened as famous musicians and politicians spoke about Louis's legacy. And when the service ended with a recording of "What a Wonderful World," Emily sang along softly, remembering the night when her small voice had helped start something beautiful. The story of that Los Angeles concert has been told and retold in the decades since Louis's death. It appears in biographies and documentaries, in music history classes and motivational speeches. But the true meaning of that night isn't about Louis Armstrong or even about music. It's about what happens when we support each other in our moments of weakness instead of judging or abandoning each other. It's about the power of community, of shared experience, of love expressed through action rather than just words. When Louis forgot the lyrics, 15,000 people could have sat in uncomfortable silence. They could have booed or walked out or demanded refunds. Instead, they sang. They lifted up someone who had spent his life lifting up others. That's the real legacy of Louis Armstrong. Not just his music, though his music is immortal. It's the example he set of generosity and kindness, of giving everything you have to your audience even when you have nothing left, of treating every person you meet with dignity and respect. And it's the example that audience set for all of us, that when someone we love is struggling, the right response isn't criticism or abandonment. The right response is to pick up the song they've dropped and sing it for them until they can sing it again themselves. Emily Carter grew up to become a music teacher. She spent her career introducing children to the joy of singing and playing instruments, and she always told her students the story of that night in Los Angeles. Music isn't about perfection, Emily would say. It's about connection. It's about sharing something beautiful with other people. The greatest musician I ever saw forgot his lyrics on stage, and it turned into the most beautiful moment I've ever witnessed. Because music isn't what one person does alone. It's what we all create together. Somewhere today, someone is listening to "What a Wonderful World," maybe on the radio during their morning commute, maybe on their phone while doing housework, maybe in a concert hall or a church or a school. And when they hear Louis Armstrong's voice singing those familiar words, they probably don't think about that night in Los Angeles when Louis forgot the lyrics and 15,000 people sang them for him. They just hear a beautiful song that makes them feel something true about the world. But that song exists because Louis Armstrong kept performing even when his body was failing. It touches people because Louis poured his entire soul into every note. And it lives on because when Louis stumbled, his audience caught him, proving that love, real love, shows up when you need it most. Louis Armstrong spent his life wondering if his music mattered. On September 14th, 1968, 15 odds and set, 1,000 people answered that question definitively. His music mattered so much that they had memorized every word. His music mattered so much that when he couldn't sing it, they sang it for him. His music mattered so much that it had become part of their lives, part of their hearts, part of who they were. And that's the most any artist can hope for, not perfection, not immortality, but the knowledge that something you created became something someone else loved enough to carry with them always. What a wonderful world indeed.